Okay. Good afternoon. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Welcome back. So we've got two more sessions for this afternoon, and my first duty is to introduce. It's a pleasure to introduce my colleague and old conference friend Bryan Warnick, who's professor of philosophy of education at Ohio State University in the College of Education and Human Ecology, and his work focuses on uh, philosophy of education, especially in the ethical dimensions of educational practice and policy. So he's going to talk to us about polarization and civic trust.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like I said, I'm Bryan Warnick. I come to you from Ohio State University. Um, as I look around the room and as I think about all the wonderful people I know in this part of the world, I want you all to know that you are lucky. You're at the center of a lot of really great scholarship, a really center of a lot of great people. This is a great part of the world that is doing a lot of thoughtful philosophical work and a lot of thoughtful educational work. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Um, what I'm going to do is present some work that it's actually more of an essay than a research project. I'm going to throw out some ideas that I hope you find interesting and provocative. Um, but my expertise is really no more than that, a provocateur today. What I'm going to talk about is this tension that I see in education between our impulse to try to help students to think for themselves and also at the same time to defer to experts. And I think as we try to do both things, we find that these things are not easy to do together, right? So I'm going to talk about ways in which we might be able to do that and some reasons about why it matters. So and I wrote this essay at the tail end of COVID. And in the US context, I don't think we handled COVID very well. And there's a lot of, I had a lot of emotions about that. And some of that will come through in this essay. All right. Surveying the current global landscape, one cannot help but be concerned about our inability to confront serious social problems in productive ways. One lingering problem, of course, is global climate change, the effects of which are now being dramatically felt nearly everywhere. Another problem, the COVID-19 pandemic, is different in some ways, but our response was similarly unimpressive. Beyond the understandable uncertainty about what to do, there was a flood of misinformation, both factual inaccuracies and confusion, and we're still dealing with the outcomes of that today. We see declining vaccination rates in the US context. What other differences? Global warming and viral pandemics are similar. All right. My slides advancing there. There we go. So these two global problems, climate change and COVID, and whatever their other differences, they're similar in that there are problems both requiring scientific and technical ability to help us resolve, and they also require a broad social consensus to confront. We have to do it together in some sense as societies. They're also similar in now that they are both screened through a partisan lens. Before 2020, mask wearing did not signal a political view, but it does now. Similarly, things like driving an electronic vehicle, politicized, right? Our views of all these issues are largely shaped through our partisan identity, and our solutions are inhibited by a divided and polarized response. So it's not hard to despair about the state of things, and it's tempting to see all of this as a failure of education, a failure of civic education, science education, maybe liberal education. Social theorist Neil Postman saw that part of the job of education was responding to current social problems. Back in the 1960s, he identified several problems of pressing social importance. He talked about the control and consolidation of big media, the rapid rate of technology change, and the rise of cold bureaucratic thinking. Postman saw the solution to all of these social problems as connecting to the advice of Ernest Hemingway, who once said about good writing that it demands a, quote, built-in, shock-proof crap detector. With all the writing about the purposes of education prevalent in his day, for Postman, crap detecting as the educational aim stood out. As I see it, he writes, the best thing schools can do for kids is to help them learn how to distinguish useful talk from bullshit. So maybe these social problems point to the fact that we're not developing these crap detecting skills in students. But how do we do that? How do we distinguish bullshit from truth? For many of the difficult technical problems we currently face, we need the help of experts. But trust in expertise seems to be eroding. We see this in climate denialism. We see this in vaccine hesitancy. And we see this in J.D. Vance, who just a few days ago in the vice presidential debate in the US mocked the idea of expertise. Author Tom Nichols, for example, he also argues that there's been a steady rise in vehemently rejecting expert guidance. He writes, quote, this is more than a natural skepticism towards experts. I fear we are witnessing the death of the ideal of expertise itself, a Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based collapse of any division between professionals and lay people, between students and teachers, between knowers and wonderers. In other words, between those of any achievement in an area and those with none at all, unquote. Of course, and Nichols admits this, none of this is entirely new, particularly in the US context. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about the US. He says, in most of the operations of the mind, each American appeals only to the individual effort of his own understanding. And a few decades ago, Richard Hofstadter noted the prominent anti-intellectualism in American life and attributed it to a sense of impotence and helplessness that individuals feel in complex and specialized societies that they cannot begin to comprehend, let alone control. The newness then of this rejection of expertise should not be exaggerated, but I think there is something new here, not just in a disregard for knowledge and expertise, but in a fiery rage towards those claiming to possess expertise. This rage is a product, I believe, of the growing political polarization and motivated reasoning that comes from it. By motivated reasoning, I mean reasoning that is used to justify a pre-existing opinion or identity, in this case, a political identity, rather than reasoning used to come to a belief about what is true. Through motivated reasoning, research shows that experts who disagree with us are seen as threats to our identities, not just our opinions, but our identities, and therefore are quickly dismissed. Political polarization contributes then to this situation of this fiery rage against experts. What is also new, I would suggest, is that an anti-intellectual, anti-elite, and anti-science sentiment has now been embraced by major news organizations in the US and by public officials in the highest positions of government. Also, new is the role of social media that has played in giving platforms to crooks and cranks from the deepest corners of ignorance and darkness, providing algorithms that amplify their ill-informed voices. Finally, the internet has produced an image in people's minds of what it means to do research. With the internet, people no longer need to venture to a library. Research seems easy. We have the tools at our fingertips to do our own research, which often proves to be a tragic mirage. Those of you that are my age know that if we had a question back in the pre-Google days, it was kind of hard to find answers to those questions. You had to go to the library and go through the card catalog and find the book and look, and even then it would be hard to find the answer, right? But now this vision of doing research is very different than what we were used to. When combined with trends in political polarization, What this research amounts to is, again, motivated thinking, motivated research, finding reasons to support your political identity. As you do your own research, you find what your political beliefs tell you to find. And that's true, I think, for everyone on both the left and the right. Surely the resolutions to these problems must be more education. But critics like Nichols suggest that education is itself part of the problem, at least the way we're doing it. The spread of higher education, with its emphasis on treating students as consumers and catering to their preferences and opinions rather than challenging them, is part of the problem. It has also created a sense of intellectual equality, a sort of I'm college educated and therefore I know as much as anybody else type of attitude. In this way, the spread of education rather than helping us has actually made the problem of rejecting expertise worse. Furthermore, some of the things educators do to build intellectual autonomy and independence to get students to think for themselves may foster an overinflated epistemic ego. Taken in the wrong way, the dictum to think for yourself ignores the social dimensions of learning and knowing, and that we must rely on others in innumerable ways in all of our epistemic endeavors. Schools these days push us to become epistemic individualists. I want to talk for a minute about this problem and how we should think about it from an educational perspective. It presents a real dilemma. On the one hand, we surely do want students to think for themselves in some sense. How could we not want this? This is the principal way we show respect to them as persons, to honor their intellectual capabilities this way. At the same time, in schools, we also need to stress the importance of what we don't know, the need for deference, deferring our own ability in certain matters to those who may know more. So I would frame this right now as a tension between epistemic self-confidence on the one hand, the idea that we can figure stuff out for ourselves, and epistemic deference on the other hand, which recognizes the limits of our own understanding. Now, my own biases always want me to think, well, where did this problem come from? You know, what's the history of this tension and this dilemma? And I think it grows actually out of the Western Enlightenment, 17th and 18th century intellectual thought. The French philosopher René Descartes forged ahead with a project of complete intellectual self-confidence. He imagined that he could doubt all that he had been taught previously, and through his own intellectual powers, reconstruct knowledge based on what he individually could be certain of. This reflects a radical epistemic individualism, the belief that one mind can gain knowledge without the help of external authority. This notion of thinking for yourself quickly became the Enlightenment ideal, echoed in Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment? Have the courage to use your own understanding, he said, should be the motto of the Enlightenment. Confidence in the individual human intellect was the chief feature of 17th and 18th century Europe. While this was happening, though, a social community of community-based knowing was also being created in the various research institutes and societies of the time. Think of the Royal Society of London, where scientists would gather to discuss their work. Knowledge was produced through networks of coordinated behaviors. And these networks proved very successful, much more so than individuals trying to work out things by themselves. Modern science advanced through the Enlightenment at such a rapid clip that it simply became too much for any one individual to know. And thus we see Goethe, who died in 1832, being classified as the last universal genius. Goethe was the last man who could kind of knew everything there was to know. After that, we're specialized, right? Also in Enlightenment, there's a growing importance in the works of more complete and global skepticism, like you see from Pierre Bayle and especially the philosopher David Hume. In his overview of the Enlightenment, William Bristow writes that in addition to intellectual self-confidence, the, quote, Enlightenment was characterized by a crisis of authority regarding any belief. This Enlightenment legacy is therefore paradoxical. It contains conflicting ideals of optimistic individual self-confidence. It contains ideals of reliance on social networks to develop knowledge. And it also has more global doubts into the question of whether we can know much of anything at all. Now, in modern political life, I believe we need to embrace both sides of this paradox. This, I think, is what it means to be a knower today, to be an informed citizen, you might say, in the modern world. The optimal post-Enlightenment knower could be framed in this way. The informed citizen is able to balance intellectual self-confidence with intellectual doubt. And this doubt exists on two levels: doubt in one's ability to know everything that can be known, as well as doubt about humankind's ability to know much of anything at all. One way of diagnosing the ills of contemporary social discourse and the ills that flow out of our rabid polarization is that something about this balance between intellectual self-confidence and intellectual deference has been skewed. Perhaps now it is the job of education to set things right. Since we seem to be erring now on the side of intellectual overconfidence, even arrogance in our polarized societies, perhaps what we need to do is reinstate a norm of intellectual humility. So let me talk a little bit about what this might mean as a virtue to embody epistemic or intellectual humility. Humility as an epistemic virtue has been, until recently, neglected in the psychological and philosophical literature. Traditionally, when you talk about humility, sometimes it was seen as someone with low self-esteem or low self-regard. One of the common features of the new literature on humility, however, stresses that humility is more like an inner self-awareness and openness to learning about the outside world. Psychologist June Tagney, working from the field of psychology, notes several features of humility. Moving away from the notion of humility that conceptualizes humility in terms of low self-esteem, Tagney argues that humility is more a sense of perspective on oneself. To be humble is to have an accurate assessment of one's own abilities and accomplishments. With this perspective comes an ability to admit mistakes. It comes with an openness to learning, a low interest in using knowledge for self-promotion, and an appreciation of the many things that contribute to one's ability to know. From a philosophical perspective, Roberts and Wood contrast humility with intellectual vanity and see vanity as an excessive concern for one's intellectual social standing. Lacking this vanity, however, is not quite enough for true humility. True humility must be also paired with an intense concern for an external good. With intellectual humility, that external good that we're trying to capture is something like truth. In the case of the intellectual virtues, then, to be epistemically humble is to place a deep concern for knowledge and truth as the reason for being open to learning and for one's lack of intellectual pretension. So you can imagine striking the pose of being humble and open because you wanted to impress your advisor or professor, or maybe earn a date, I guess, with someone that valued that. But so when you're really intellectually humble, you do it so that for the purpose of finding truth. It is not so much the epistemically humble refuse to believe that they possess certain strengths. Indeed, to refuse to acknowledge one's own strengths would be a defect rather than a virtue. Rather, the humble are simply unconcerned with how this strength makes them look compared to others. Their intellectual excellence is not used for the purposes of social comparison or to advance their political identities, but in the service of the higher intellectual good. Finally, Dennis Whitcomb and colleagues present intellectual epistemic humility as existing as a mean between two extremes, an Aristotelian framework here. On one extreme, we have intellectual arrogance. On the other extreme, we have intellectual humility. Both intellectual humility and intellectual self-confidence exist between those two extremes. Indeed, the humble person is actually self-confident in appropriate ways. This is because, as Whitcomb conceives it, humility is a state of properly attending to one's own limitations. Humility is the state of owning up to one's intellectual weaknesses, right? So one of my weaknesses is I'm not really good with other languages. And that's a real weakness for me when it comes to learning. I need to own up to that, not only that it's part of my flaws, but also all the epistemic consequences, my lack of being able to learn that flow through that. Intellectual arrogance, in contrast, is not owning up to one's gaps in knowledges and experiences, one's cognitive mistakes, one's deficits in experiences. On the other side, proper intellectual pride or proper self-confidence is owning up to one's strengths, realizing that one can use epistemic resources that one does have, thus avoiding the vice of intellectual servility, on the other hand. To these philosophical reflections on humility, I would also emphasize that humility comes in two forms. The first is recognizing how much of all that is known in this hyper-specialized forms of society that we live on, how much of that how little we know of it as individuals. Even the most educated person among us only knows the tiniest fraction of all that is known among humanity. Under such circumstances, the wise choice is to intelligently defer to those who know more. And this is largely a product of trusting institutions and other markers that provided to us that designate whose expertise can be trusted. The other form of intellectual humility has to do with realizing how much is unknown by anybody, even experts, and in some cases will probably never be fully known. This type of humility, it makes us less invested in any of our beliefs, less likely to fight and perhaps to kill for them, and less likely to subjugate all our reasoning to support some ultimate belief that we have. In sum, then, to have intellectual humility is to have a sense of perspective on one's knowledge and to place reasoning and to base value on reasoning for the sake of truth itself, rather than to win some competition. It avoids the vices of servility and arrogance by owning up to our limitations and also recognizing our strengths. In recognizing strengths and limitations, it conceives individual level ignorance, what I personally do not know, with a species level ignorance, what humanity does not know. All these factors will come into play as we think about how intellectual humility can be promoted in education. A healthy public discourse will be characterized by individuals who possess intellectual self-confidence, that proper pride, and also this intellectual humility. Both are important in societies who try to grapple with large-scale technical problems and polarization. To promote intellectual humility, the educational solution at first seems to be simple. We need to send students a stronger message of their limitations and re-emphasize the importance of yielding to people who know more than they do. In other words, it seems to be that now is the time to emphasize and even celebrate notions of expertise in schools. According to this argument, we have far too long coddled student self-esteem. We've rewarded mediocre efforts. We've validated every random student opinion and placed students as judge and jury over their teachers. As it currently stands, schools are sending the message that the knowledge earned through hard study does not really matter all that much, since all their opinions ultimately are of equal worth. All of this makes students susceptible to the bullshit that will come from the outside, or as they eventually become shovelers of bullshit themselves. At least this is the argument. We need to take students down a notch and to promote this humility. Now, there may be some wisdom to this line of thinking, but in the end, this position for humbling students ignores a lot of complexities. First, learning how to question authority, how to think for oneself, still remains an important aim of education. And the sort of deference that this other view promotes works against this as a desirable intellectual aim. We do want students to think for themselves. Without great care, this enforced deference to others turns into a sort of servility, which does not capture proper respect for student status as knowers. Second problem, some degree of skepticism about experts is warranted, and a healthy type of skepticism needs to be recognized with any type of humility. Clearly, experts can be wrong about a whole sort of different things. Third, not all social groups would be equally served by this project of epistemic humbling. Those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds have already too often been told that their voices and opinions and experiences simply do not matter. As Miranda Fricker has noted, they have been denied epistemic credibility. In such cases, continuing to build intellectual self-confidence seems to be most appropriate and required as a matter of basic fairness rather than simple humbling them, right? What this all implies is that we need a more nuanced way of thinking about intellectual humility in education, along the lines of the humility that I've described in the philosophical literature. That is to say, a humility that is about taking perspective, about owning one's strengths and limitations, and about deprioritizing other identities and values, including politically polarized identities, in favor of a truth-seeking identity. So what sort of educational experiences will promote this sort of dispositional humility? And here I offer some speculative suggestions on how this might be promoted. This is because I haven't researched these to see if they actually work, to promote epistemic humility. They just seem like interesting ideas to think about and talk about. So that's where these come from. So first is promoting an inward focused critical thinking. Gaining this humility will first require a type of critical thinking more attuned to self-examination rather than issue examination. In the development of critical thinking in the literature there has been a significant focus on questioning external authorities and questioning one's beliefs about the larger world. Even Socrates, for example, we see as highly competent at questioning social authorities and everyone else's beliefs about the world. Socrates, though, is less successful, I would argue, at questioning his own motives and his own critical powers. He does not sift through his memories, for example, questioning his life mission and his self-assigned identity as gadfly. Since the time of Socrates, critical thinking has had a distinctly external focus, looking at one's beliefs about the world rather than beliefs about the self who is doing the believing. This external focus is part of what drives, I think, this partisan motivated thinking that drives polarization, and the eagerness to find experts who simply conform to one's own preconceptions. It is a critical thinking at the service of an already established self. A more internally focused self-examination would focus on one's own motives, one's own priorities, one's own biases, rather than putting the stories that comprise the self under critical scrutiny. Why do I trust this expert rather than that? What is driving the reasoning that I'm using in this particular case? Rather than focusing simply on the self, what the self believes about the world, critical thinking should also focus on one's own identity as a believing and knowing subject. I've argued elsewhere that a critical engagement with memoir as a literary genre might help facilitate this self-questioning and the particular sort of examined life that grows out of it. Perhaps this self-work, aided by memoir, will reduce the sort of polarized motivational thinking that we're seeing in the world, and also promote things like the symmetrical thinking that we heard about earlier today in the first talk. All right, speculative suggestion two, anti-scholarship. Intellectual humility involves a perspective on oneself as a knower, owning one's strengths and limitations. To develop this perspective, educators should do more to celebrate the recognition of limitations within classrooms. In schools, we do much to emphasize that students must form and defend their opinions, even before they are remotely qualified to hold an opinion on a subject. In this, we send the message that to be smart, to be educated, means that one rushes to know, that one can quickly become sufficiently informed to hold beliefs about a topic, even topics that are well beyond one's limitations. It is surely important to help students to learn and develop their voices and to understand how to craft an argument, but these activities need to be counterbalanced with activities that promote a self conscious awareness of one's limitations. How might we do this? Author Nassim Nicholas Taleb has some ideas along these lines. In one passage, he discusses the author Umberto Eco's vast library of books, many of which Eco celebrated for being unread. It's like, look at these books, and I've only read 80, half of them. These unread books formed a sort of anti-library. This anti-library was important for Eco because they reminded him of all the things he didn't know, all the knowledge that he had not yet tapped into. Reflecting on this, Taleb writes, people don't walk around with their anti-resumes telling you what they have not studied or experienced. It's the job of their competitors to do that. But it would be nice if they did. Just as we need to stand library logic on its head, we should work on standing knowledge itself on its head. This passage makes me think of various strategies we could use to have students reflect on what they do not know. We could have them work on their anti-resumes, documenting all the skills, credentials, experiences that they have not had. Maybe they could list their own anti-libraries, naming all the key books that they themselves have not read. Maybe they could write anti-papers with antitheses, explaining all the ways in which they are unqualified to state an opinion about a controversial topic. Developing these skills might be an important part of the epistemic humility that is needed. As Taleb writes, let us call this person an anti-scholar, someone who focuses on the unread books and makes an attempt not to treat his knowledge as a treasure or even a possession or even a self-esteem enhancement tool. All right, how am I doing on time? How much time do I have? 10 more minutes? Not? Oh, okay. All right. Right on time then. Three, understanding the social processes of knowledge. Here you could also comfort with the messiness of science. All right. To gain the right sort of perspective on expert knowledge and their own relationship to it, students need to better understand how knowing works, particularly in the realm of science. Science is never a clean and unambiguous endeavor, and skepticism is indeed sometimes warranted in the case of scientific knowledge claims. An understanding of the epistemic limitations of science, the problem of induction, or the social nature of science, the cultural biases and incentive structures, as well as the imperfect human side of science that we see in things like data fabrication. All of this point to the idea that scientific claims themselves can be wrong and that much scientific knowledge should be taken as provisional. On top of that, the media does a poor job of explaining this provisional nature of science. This leads to a condition, I think, in which the science is seen as contradictory, ephemeral, and not to be trusted. Society, including educators and journalists, need to do a better job of showing how warranted knowledge claims are often born out of these admittedly ugly processes, and how, in the face of such messiness, one can still find an informed consensus. One answer for how to spread a greater comfort with the complexity and messiness of science is for, I think, a greater awareness of the history of science, the chaotic processes of how even the most solid discoveries that we have now have come about, and how controversy and disagreements have been present in every step of the way. So I think this is somewhat counterintuitive, that being open to the messiness of science will actually help to increase the trust in scientific experts, because it's kind of being more transparent about the messiness of science. Pulling down the myths of science could serve to make science stronger. Suggestion number 4, speculative suggestion 4, carving out spaces for public voice. We might divide knowledge into two realms, the empirical and the moral. It makes sense to be differential to others when it comes to facts about the world. Right? Lots of people know facts about the world I don't know. It feels different, however, to cede to experts questions of right and wrong, questions of value. This distinction between different realms of action is something that can be suggested to students. And this distinction might resolve a possible solution to, or perhaps more likely a small mitigation of, the heated resentment towards expert authority that people like Hofstadter and Nichols have sometimes noted. For these writers, anti-intellectual resentment is fueled by the lack of control experienced by people in an increasingly technical and complex world. So one possible solution to this sort of alienation might include carving out realms where voices and autonomous action can be maintained, even in the face of technical complexity. The realm of moral and political values might be such a realm. So Dewey actually has this great example of democracy and how it proceeds. So, we look to shoemakers to make shoes for us. They have the technical knowledge. But we have the knowledge to say, this is where it pinches. This is where my shoe hurts. This is where it's uncomfortable. And we have a voice in taking that particular knowledge, the knowledge from our experience, to people with technical expertise. That's a real realm for having a voice, and we need to kind of highlight and preserve that realm as much as we can. So one way to mitigate the rage against experts is to better educate people by helping them claim their substantive role in a value-driven research process. Perhaps understanding this role will help us feel more connected with experts, making us feel less alienated from the process of policymaking, and less alienated in our place in these complex modern societies. And also this we could bring up so we have this technical knowledge, what do we do now with it? That action question that we heard earlier today with respect to climate change, that what do we do with it? Finally, speculative suggestion 5, experiencing expertise, having students experience what it feels like to be an expert, right? As educators walk this tightrope between intellectual servility and intellectual arrogance, they need to help students to become experts in some areas relating to their academic work, however narrow their expertise may be. We need to assist students in feeling confidence in their intellectual powers, but also link that confidence to realization about the time and effort that is necessary to develop those powers and that justify that confidence. In short, the message should be to students that they can understand the complexities of the world, but that they almost certainly do not understand most of the complexities of the world because of all the time and effort involved in understanding those complexities. This knowledge of expertise and how hard it is, but how possible it is for them to do it, seems essential to developing the sort of perspective that comes with epistemic humility. One of the best ways to understand expertise, I suggest, is to try to become an expert in something in at least some small way. One example of what this might look like in the classroom comes from Ron Berger's really great book, An Ethic of Excellence, Building a Culture of Craftsmanship with Students. Berger's classrooms are project-centered, often tackling narrow community problems. The students do real research on these problems. There's effort, there's precision, there's attention to detail, and students become the expert. Like in the little stream that flows next to town,
What's going on with that stream? How is the wildlife doing? What pollution levels are present? They become almost the world's leading experts on that little stream next to the school. The students gain something approaching a form of expertise with respect to these community problems, even if it is a scaffolding type of expertise. This sort of experience of becoming experts is an important part of respecting expertise. It will show the real time and effort involved, and teachers can do much within the process to build a general sense of epistemic humility, highlighting the relationship between knowledge and expertise and its implications for students moving forward. Now, just to conclude, social problems like pandemics and global climate change call for widespread agreement about pathways for collective action. These problems share the fact that they require a degree of technical expertise. The technical nature of these problems necessitates a trust in scientific and medical experts, and this trust requires a degree of intellectual humility on the part of the democratic citizenry. Fostering this humility should be part of civic and indeed academic education. This implies that we de-emphasize in some way the Enlightenment ideal of thinking for yourself and remind students of the other side of the Enlightenment, namely recognizing one's place in a larger tapestry of knowing. At the same time, we need to avoid intellectual servility and sensitize students to the fact that experts can indeed be wrong. This is not an easy educational task, and I have in this talk made several suggestions about how educators might walk this line. The problem of political polarization, I believe, is in part a problem of a self that filters everything through the lens of partisan politics. My hope is that through education, we can soften that up a bit, allowing for a voice of expertise without crowding out the voice of the individual. My hope is that we can indeed encourage people to do their own research, but now with a sense of perspective on their strengths and limitations as individual knowers. My hope is that as people begin to question what they know, and perhaps importantly, what can be known, they will hold their partisan identities a little less closely, a little less dear, and see their adversaries in a little less threatening light. So, my expert opinion is this: I don't believe that education can solve all the problems of polarizing democracies, but it can be a small part of a larger solution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'm going to introduce the respondent to Brian's talk, Vivek Venkatesh, Dean of Education at McGill. A lot of Vivek's work focuses on the prevention of radical extremism, violence, and he also has an awesome guitar collection in his office and vinyl. So ask him to show it to you if he has time. Vivek, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to your excellent paper, Brian. I hope that when you do get it published, that larger community, including everyone here, has an opportunity to read it as well. I just want to thank Kevin and Dave Waddington for putting together an absolutely splendid event. It's really great. In French, they talk about l'activation des espaces d'apprentissage, activation of learning spaces. I think that doesn't showcase precisely how lively this event is. I really feel the enlivening of this space is really important. It has a specific feel to it, a very communal feel to it, which is really important. And I think that you're bringing up some very important topics, which can be particularly polarizing for us to discuss. And so most of my reflections here are going to I guess focus on how I reacted to your paper, given my own theoretical but also artistic orientations. So if you'll permit me, I'll take a more personal stance in terms of how this how my response is going to unfold. The other thing as well is that this is the first time I'm participating in an event where we have prepared speeches and then we have a little bit of time as respondents, about a week or so, to read, reflect, to kind of gather our thoughts and impressions, but also come here to perhaps activate a certain conversation after, or catalyze a conversation. So in that interest, I won't be too long because I know we have a whole group of people here who might want to ask Bryan some questions. How much time do I have to activate this so I don't end up um, going too much? Are we until 2:10 here? So about maybe 5 minutes or so of kind of just my thoughts, and then we can get to questions, which I think will be really interesting. So uh, yeah, this is particularly important for me, especially given that this is the first academic event since becoming dean of the Faculty of Education that I'm participating in, and the fact that it represents a field of research, a field of practice in which I'm intimately involved, is also a great way for me to think carefully about how to position the work that we're all engaged in. I think it's important to also situate ourselves historically and personally in this work. I'm a former school teacher. I have graduate degrees in the learning sciences, but mainly focused in statistics and development of fairly complex statistical models. But I'm a recovering statistician. As some of you know, Dave Waddington knows me well, having seen me go through the process of giving up some of those epistemological orientations and working mainly now in the field of art. I make documentaries, feature films, and then participate in various musical projects that broadly look at ways in which we can magnify narratives of dispossession. So, what does dispossession look like? What do inequities look like? I rail against identity politics quite vehemently, quite ferociously. I try and do that from a theoretical standpoint, and then I try and bring those to bear in terms of the artistic disruptions that my projects entail. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about is grounded in arts-based pedagogies, and I feel very much like a novice in that regard. Gotten over most of the fear of failure, in as much as a fear of also being taken for a fraud in that regard, because the arts, believe it or not, are as gatekeeping minded as we are in terms of statistics or even educational philosophy. So the arts-based pedagogies that I've engaged in were developed because of work that was funded for about 10 years between 2014 and 2024 under the aegis of a project I developed called Project Someone, Social Media Education Every Day. And so this project broadly looked at how we could build spaces for pluralism and pluralistic dialogue. We worked in a number of communities which were identified as vulnerable, marginalized. I think dispossession, which is a term I learned from a Métis colleague at University of Alberta, fits the orientation quite well. But these communities came from Canada. We worked a lot in the United States, in the Bay Area, in Norway and in Iceland, and also in Lebanon, Morocco, in India, which is where I was born. And so there have been various ways in which we've tried to bring those voices, the specific voices in situ, in context, to bear on pedagogical practices. We do this through documentaries. We do it through community orientations where we work with communities to build artistic installations. We use various kinds and leverage various kinds of artistic tools, whether it's music, whether it's documentation and films, whether it's installation art. And you could find some of that work if you look at projectsomeone.ca. You can look at some of the projects that are work that we've worked on. It's mostly shut down now because I have a new role here as an administrator, and I think that needs to be taken up in terms of sustainable leadership with new ideas. I tend to repeat myself, as you're going to see as I speak about this work as well. Um, the major aspect of the work that was catalyzed by Bryan's essay was the notion of agonism, which, unsurprisingly enough, Dave and Kevin actually introduced me to through work since then I've become a big fan of. And so uh, notions of agonism and pluralistic ways of treating agonism. Chantal Mouffe, who's a really great political science scholar from Belgium originally, works out of England now, and how we could frame and create spaces for dialogue through agonism. One of the latest pieces that I've been working on focuses on discomfort, and that's something that came up as I guess, a tactic that might be able to deploy in classrooms. How might we be able to create spaces for discomfort? And discomfort as axes for more social forms of pedagogy, a social pedagogy which allows us to actually reify what our colleague Eamon Callan calls intellectually unsafe spaces, whether it's within or without classrooms. I'm not particularly I don't particularly take that to heart. I think it needs to happen more and more often. How do we remain intellectually unsafe, and how do we remain agonistic about ideas and about ways in which we might be disagreeing with others? So your work around this, I think, is particularly captivating, and I applaud you for taking both the historical stance, but then also giving us something really practical. When I developed my own theory of social pedagogy with a colleague of mine, Bradley Nelson, uh, the first the first few times we tried to publish it, we got rejected, saying that this work is, the word that was used by the editor was discomforting. It's really taking us in places where we don't feel social justice forms of education should go. We ended up publishing it in a French collection first, which I think goes to show how, as you were pointing out, linguistic differences and epistemic frames are brought to bear in different forms. And we were fortunate enough, Brad and I, to be able to employ our own linguistic flexibilities to adapt that work into French, which I think was really important. But since then, we've also found ways to make it less uncomfortable for an English-speaking audience. So we have published this in English now. But social pedagogies and the work that's arrived and that we're working through with social pedagogies, people keep saying, well, how do you enact a social pedagogy? It's one thing to think about it from a theoretical standpoint. It's one thing to rely on, I guess, a deductive model where you say, here's the projects we've done, here's what we've achieved, here's how social forms of pedagogy work. And so I've come to a point where I've thought carefully about how do I give some strategies for piercing these silos or echo chambers that we reside in. We've talked about silos earlier today. And in terms of discomfort, how do we also remain uncomfortable as thought leaders within these respective silos? I think there's two ways of thinking about it. One is, how do we remain uncomfortable about our own discomfort? How do we learn to listen to the other side without necessarily intervening, right? So using your ears and not your mouth, literally. Keep listening, get more uncomfortable, get angry if you must, but then come back to your echo chamber, come back to your silo and speak to your acolytes and tell them a little bit about how epistemic frames on the other side sound like and feel like. Why do you think people think the way they think? And that might then help you to build a space for conversation with the other side. We, I think, jump too quickly into thinking about how we might be able to enter into conversations, decry, descend into ad hominem attacks, and that happens over and over again. So part of those breaking of silos, I think, resides in acknowledging discomfort as a key axis of social forms of pedagogy. And then the final thing I'll say is that I think it's important for us to engage with shame. In my latest paper, I've begun to theorize on how shame might be a way for us to express our own humility, and I think that there's something for us to take in that regard. I'll sign off by uh, giving you an analysis of a poem that I'm really fond of, which is written by a Puerto Rican poet. His name is Fortunato Vizacarrondo. Is anybody familiar with Spanish poetry from Puerto Rico here? No. So the name of this poem is "Y tu abuela dónde está?" Uh, what the title stands for is "And your grandmother, where is she?" And the poem is interesting in as much as it relates a conversation between a white Puerto Rican and a black Puerto Rican. And the white Puerto Rican begins each stanza of the poem becoming increasingly racist as he speaks to the black Puerto Rican counterpart. He comments on the size of the lips, he comments on the skin color, and he ratchets it up with each stanza. But at the end of each stanza, there's one question that the black Puerto Rican asks his white counterpart, and it's, "Y tu abuela dónde está?" And your grandmother, where is she? So you're kind of asking, like, why is he asking this question? Where is he leading to with this? So at the end of the poem, you realize that the white Puerto Rican has an African grandmother who's hidden in the kitchen of the household because they're ashamed of the fact that the black part of the family is not as far as they thought it would be. It's a really great way for us to think about shame as an ethic for dissent. If we can be mindful about how identity politics tend to negate and tend to obscure and even obfuscate the ways in which we can engage with each other, then I think we'll be at we'll be all the better in terms of thinking about how to get our students to think for one another, but without this frame of ad hominem attacks that are so prevalent now. I'll stop there and really looking forward to questions for Bryan. Yeah.
Okay, folks, Kevin and I have our mics at the ready, and I see there's already hands up for questions, which is all the better. So I'll take our first question over here.
Hello. So my question is for Bryan, but it's also for Maya, because I see such a big connection between some of the topics that you both talked about. And I just wanted to, well, be specific, your idea of theorizing with others and your idea with intellectual humility and also being able to defer to experts. So I'm just thinking like, my question for you is, to what extent would it be possible to theorize with others without intellectual humility? I'm interested in your answer to that. I'm also interested in your answer to that. And then just to take it a step further, and how could a person theorizing with others also be deferring to experts? So it's kind of like combining your guys' ideas.
It's kind of weird to sit down and answer a question because I'm used to standing up in a classroom and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think humility is almost kind of a prerequisite to the sort of dialogues that we want to be having. So on the one hand, we could be intellectually servile, right? So we could just take what others say and not put our own individual analysis of it or stamp on it. You know, we just accept what other people tell us. There's a servility to it, right? There's no us in the equation. Then on the other extreme, there's that epistemic arrogance, right? Where we have all the answers. We might be polarized in the sense that we're driving towards either defending our own identity or the identity of the groups that we happen to belong to. And in the middle of those two extremes is where dialogue can truly happen. It's that epistemic humility, where you both realize the strengths that I bring to this discussion on the one hand, but also being keenly open to, you know, where others can help me see what I'm not seeing right now, the limitations of my own sort of experiences. And you know, having that perspective, I think, is absolutely essential to having a dialogue that is worthy of the name, right? That gets to this idea of a democratic engagement with the other, where we're all changed and we can perhaps escape the engagement with something new, right? What was the other second half of the question?
How can you then bring in different experts without kind of like kind of distancing their ideas?
So like saying, well, the experts say, um, that's a great question. So I think uh, first of all, I think bringing the other voice into um, dialogue with the expert. All right. So, you know, I've heard that vaccines are actually quite helpful. And I've read a lot of experts that say that. Um, but open up a space for that person to express their concerns about what the expert might be saying, right? So they might say, well, the expert might not have taken this into account, or they're blinded by this particular bias. So bring in whatever experience or voices they have into dialogue with the expert, but bring in the expert. You know, I think that's an important part of the debate, but not as a end of discussion, but as a leaping forward in the discussion.
Thank you, and thanks for tying these two together. I think Bryan and I were using sort of complementary language of epistemic arrogance. I was finding that in the post-truth rhetoric and discourse, while epistemic humility is this openness to hearing what other people have to say, not necessarily agreeing with them, but recognizing that, you know, I may not have all the answers and I might learn something from you. Now, to your question about where expertise fits in, um, it might be worth thinking about that there are many forms of expertise, not just the kind of, when we talk about experts, we usually think about some kind of, intellectual expert, the PhD, or people with letters next to their names. But there's all kinds of sociology literature on what's sometimes called lay expertise, this idea that, or experiential expertise is probably a better word for it, this idea that our lived experience provides certain insight and even certain expertise. So it's always a mistake for the intellectuals to come in and tell people what they need to do. And that's why we have, success with things like community engagement projects, community-based research, where you recognize that the people who live the life have insights that the academic experts don't. So when you recognize that there's different expertise that you can bring to the table, you don't need to you don't need to weaponize expertise as a thing that they have or a thing that I have and you don't. And instead it comes back to that sort of middle ground that Brian described, where epistemic humility is the better guide for discourse and deliberation.
It ties back to your idea of transparency.
Just take the mic.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say it kind of ties back to your idea of transparency. You brought up transparency in the field of science and how tearing down the myths of science would be very helpful in people gaining trust in that institution again. And I love that idea, by the way. I think transparency, we should push that in all the fields, because I think the lack of trust isn't just in science, it's kind of everywhere. And again, that ties back to a lot of your information. So it's a very interesting connection.
Oh, sure, Brian, go ahead.
I love this idea of everyone's an expert in something, and it reminds me of that shoe metaphor, right? So we are experts on if the shoe is pinching us. And if the expert says, "Oh, it's really not pinching you there." No, oh, it is pinching us there, right? But then we turn to them and say, "All right, now how do you build a shoe that doesn't pinch me there?" And then you can evaluate it after or try on different types of shoes. So I think that metaphor is the shoe fits the metaphor. I tried to make a bad joke there. So it's a good productive way of thinking about it.
This question comes from a place of discomfort in a way with the term epistemic humility, because for me, I don't know, I probably don't know enough about it. It seems like a potential killer in a way, because who am I as a teacher to go into a classroom and then to decide about the weaknesses and strengths of my students? I just see them for a limited time in the classroom, So it really has that difficulty for me in itself. And another point that I would make in that sense is I also have in diverse classrooms, as there are now students who have, for example, traumatic experiences coming from having a refugee background and so on. And for them to just working out their weaknesses seems to me like counterproductive, like, yeah. How is your
Yeah, no, I agree. I think for oppressed populations, like I said, we need to treat that very delicately, right? Because these are populations that are used not to having their voices heard or their experiences valued. They're not represented as experts in anything or in any way. So I think that this project of helping people be more deferent applies very differently in those sorts of populations.
So would you say that epistemic humility is kind of a concept that we use for privileged students?
Yeah, in some sense, yes. Right? In some sense, yes. Um, at the same time, I love how you're very cautious about the teacher coming in and identifying strengths and weaknesses. I do think there is a role for a teacher in doing that, but I also think one of the teacher's jobs is to help students come to think about that themselves. Right? What are my strengths and limitations? So the teacher isn't the final judge and actually needs to tread kind of lightly on those sorts of things. But helping students go through this process of self-evaluation might be a more helpful way of thinking about it.
If I could exercise a organizer's prerogative just to join this, it strikes me that there's some interesting possibilities or connections between, the idea of agonism and its role in potential role in cultivating epistemic humility here, in the sense that, you know, agonism seems to imply, an agonistic approach seems to imply, you know, a need for and cultivating a strong sort of sense of intellectual candor, right? Willing to sort of express oneself honestly, even at the risk of, you know, inciting conflict, right? Whereas your sort of portrayal of epistemic humility, I don't think it's, you know, sort of conceptually sort of necessary, but I mean, it sort of certainly emphasizes the need for, you know, sort of reflection and listening and, you know, sort of self-understanding, you know, in a sort of critical, reflective way. And it seems to me that there may be sort of like different polarities depending on where you're positioned in the power sort of relationships about, you know, where you stand on that spectrum between, you know, expressiveness, candor, you know, and listening and reflection. So I just wanted to say that, but no, I think also.
This is a slightly different direction, although I think there's some connection. I loved a lot about the idea of epistemic humility, but in looking over these four speculative suggestions, there's one where I find myself stuck. And it's the fourth one, the notion of carving out spaces for more productive public engagement with solutions. And the reason comes down to this notion that you can separate technical expertise from more technical action, technical decisions from moral decisions. The long history of the sociology of science, as it pertains to the public engagement with science in particular, suggests that the technical phase, what Collins calls the technical phase, is in fact a deeply political thing. And that it is always the effort of technical experts to draw a line around who can contribute to that phase. The shoemaker's job to say, I am the shoemaker. I am the person that contributes to the design of the shoe. Your role, your place, is to tell me where the shoe pinches. And in practice, many, many things, to take an example, the presence or absence of lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, the role of patients in advocating for different clinical trial procedures and the HIV crisis of the 90s were both places where experts attempted to bound the technical phase, and those who were not perceived to be experts had to break those boundaries in order to participate in the technical phase of the process. So I think it's, do you see, in the face of that sort of intellectual history, do you see how might you, do you think it's worth modifying the notion that one can distinguish between a moral phase and a technical phase, or is that a notion that you would like to try to maintain?
Great question. There is an underlying positivism to this distinction that I made, the fact value distinction. And I am aware of those sorts of issues. And I guess, you know, they're involving the lay public in the actual design of like a research agenda makes a lot of sense, because the lay public might be able to see things in how a research agenda is laid out that the researchers themselves can't. It's like, hey, where's my population, right? In this, you're only looking at this population rather than another population. So I do think I did draw a hard and fast distinction here, which under close scrutiny could certainly be more, should be softened up. But the broad strokes, I think, are okay. I mean, I do think that there's the lay public is powerfully involved in saying, here's the problems that we need to be solved, that we need to solve. Here's where we need technical expertise. And at the end, kind of an evaluation phase, it's like, well, did this solve the problem? What new problems did it create? There is room for the lay public involvement in the actual research design itself. But I think even highlighting the major roles it's important to note. So I guess I do take that seriously. But I think for practical purposes, this this does open up avenues for a voice that even most people would see that's closed off to them.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end of the discussion time for this for this session, and there's a short coffee break, and we'll come back at is it 2:20? Am I right? 2:20 for the next section. Thanks very much, Brian and Vivek.